She was easy to overlook, and she preferred it that way. Fob Kestrel sat like a scar on the eastern Afghan landscape, a fortified compound of dust, sandbags, concertina wire, and men who had long stopped flinching at the sound of distant gunfire. It was not a place built for comfort. It was built for survival, and everyone inside it wore that purpose like a second skin. Rank mattered here. Experience mattered here. The louder you were, the more space you occupied, the more seriously people took you. Specialist Ilara Voss occupied almost no space at all. She had arrived at Fob Kestrel on a Tuesday, unremarkable weather, unremarkable transport, unremarkable paperwork. She had been processed through intake by a half-asleep corporal who misspelled her name twice and didn't apologize. She had been assigned a bunk in the female quarters, a converted storage room with 3 other women, and handed a duty schedule that placed her in the medical tent every morning at 600. No one gave her a formal introduction. No one gave her a tour. A sergeant pointed at the tent and said, "Supplies are inside, keep them organized." Then he walked away. She unpacked her bag that night in 11 minutes flat. She had learned to travel light. By her second morning, she had reorganized the entire medical supply inventory, cross-referenced by injury type, access priority, and shelf life. She created a color-coded system on index cards and taped it to the inside of the main supply cabinet. She said nothing about it to anyone. The duty medic, Corporal Haynes, noticed it 3 days later and assumed someone else had done it. That was fine. She wasn't doing it for credit. The operators of SEAL Team 6's Delta Element moved through Fob Kestrel the way apex predators move through any environment, with the casual, unhurried authority of men who knew exactly what they were capable of and had nothing left to prove to anyone. They were loud in the way that only truly dangerous men can afford to be loud, laughing hard, talking fast, filling every room they entered with an energy that made other soldiers stand a little straighter without quite understanding why. They never looked at Ilara directly. She was simply part of the landscape to them, like the water cooler, like the folding chairs stacked against the east wall, like the hand sanitizer dispenser nobody used. She moved around them quietly, refilled supply shelves while they talked over her head, and listened to everything. She was very good at listening. Master Chief Damon Ray's Delta's senior operator, broad-shouldered and sharp-eyed with a scar that ran from his left jaw to his collarbone, passed the med tent entrance one afternoon and glanced in. Ilara was cataloging medications with her back to the door. He looked for exactly 1 second, registered administrative staff, and kept walking. Later, he would not be able to remember her face from that moment. Later, he would think about that a great deal. There were others who barely registered her either. Lieutenant Carver, who ran logistics, Sergeant Briggs, who ran his mouth, the 2 younger privates who played cards every evening outside the mess tent and whistled at anything that moved. They stopped when Ilara walked past, looked, found nothing that matched their expectations, and went back to their cards. She wasn't what they were looking for. She rarely was. None of them saw what was underneath the quietness. They didn't see the way her eyes tracked every person who came into the med tent, clocking their gait, their posture, the way they held an injured arm or favored a particular leg. They didn't see her reading medical literature on a battered tablet every night after lights out, not because she had to, but because she believed there was always something more to learn. They didn't see her running 3 miles before dawn every morning alone in boots, on a route that took her past the perimeter wire, not for exercise, but because she needed to know the layout of every inch of that base. Old habit, useful habit. They saw a quiet girl with a clipboard. They saw exactly what she allowed them to see. Ilara Voss had spent enough of her life being looked past, talked over, and professionally dismissed that she had stopped wasting energy fighting it. Let them underestimate. Let them assume. Let them build their comfortable little picture of who she was and what she was capable of, because the moment that picture shattered, it would shatter completely, and they would never quite see the world the same way again. She didn't know exactly when that moment would come. She only knew, with the quiet certainty of someone who has spent years preparing for a test no one else knew was coming, that it would. And when it did, she would be ready. She was always ready. The briefing happened at 2100 hours, behind closed doors, in the operations room that nobody entered without a reason, and nobody left without a weight on their chest. Delta Element sat around the tactical table, 8 men, 8 sets of eyes fixed on the illuminated map projected against the far wall. The target was a high-value insurgent commander named Khalid Farouk, a man responsible for 3 coordinated attacks on coalition supply lines, and the disappearance of 2 embedded intelligence officers whose fate nobody discussed out loud. He had been tracked to a compound 12 kilometers east of Fob Kestrel, in a valley that the locals had a name for, and the soldiers had learned to respect. Lieutenant Colonel Harris ran the briefing with the efficiency of a man who had done this so many times the words came out pre-sharpened. 40 minutes. Clean extraction. 2 helicopter support units standing by. Intelligence confirmed the compound had minimal armed presence, 4 guards, no heavy weapons, no indication of outside support. Master Chief Reyes studied the map and said nothing. He had learned, over 22 years of operations that looked clean on paper, that the map was always lying about something. He just couldn't see what yet. At 2300 hours, Delta Element moved out. The Afghan night swallowed them immediately, 8 shadows dissolving into a darkness so complete it felt almost physical. They moved in practiced silence, communicating in gestures and breath, covering ground with the fluid efficiency of men whose bodies had been trained far past the point where the mind needed to give instructions. The temperature had dropped sharply. The valley ahead was quiet. Too quiet, Reyes thought, but he had thought that before and been wrong. This time he wasn't. The ambush triggered at the 17-minute mark, 200 meters from the compound's outer wall. It came from the eastern ridge first, a rocket-propelled grenade that streaked out of the darkness and detonated 6 feet from Delta's lead pair. The shockwave threw both men off their feet. Before the dust settled, small arms fire erupted from 3 separate positions, north, east, and from a dried creek bed to the south that the intelligence report had described as unoccupied. It was a killing box. Somebody had built it specifically for them. "Contact east, contact south," the radio exploded with voices. "Man down, we have man down." Corporal Davies took a round through the upper thigh and went down hard, his scream cutting through the gunfire for 1 terrible second before discipline took over and he went silent. Specialist Ortega was hit by shrapnel from a second RPG and lost consciousness before anyone could reach him. Sergeant Polk took a bullet that passed clean through his left shoulder, stayed on his feet, kept firing, because that was who Polk was, and nobody had ever found a way to stop him. Reyes was already on the radio, pulling the helicopters in. The extraction helicopter, call sign Razor 2, came in fast and low, rotors hammering the darkness. It took a rocket to its underbelly at 50 feet. The pilot fought it for 4 terrible seconds, managed to keep it airborne and banked hard away from the valley, trailing smoke, unable to land, unable to come back. Razor 2 is hit, Razor 2 is hit, unable to extract, repeat, unable to extract. The words landed like a second explosion. 8 men, 3 wounded, 2 of them critically. No helicopter, no extraction window, enemies still firing from elevated positions. 12 kilometers of hostile terrain between them and the only place on Earth that could help them. Reyes made the call in under 3 seconds. "We move, now. We carry our people and we move." What followed was not a retreat. Reyes refused to call it that then and in every account afterward. It was a fighting withdrawal, disciplined, brutal, and held together entirely by the kind of unit cohesion that cannot be trained and cannot be faked. They moved in rotation, laying suppressing fire, pulling their wounded, covering each other through a darkness that seemed to close in tighter with every step. Davies passed out from blood loss 40 minutes in. Two operators carried him between them without breaking stride. Ortega's breathing became shallow and irregular. Reyes monitored him personally, counting breaths, watching his color, silently calculating how much time they had. The answer was not enough. They pushed harder. When the lights of Fob Kestrel finally appeared through the darkness, distant, cold, impossibly welcome, nobody celebrated. They were past celebration. They were running on something deeper than adrenaline now, something closer to sheer refusal. They crashed through the fob entrance at 22:47 hours, carrying 3 broken men, covered in blood that was not all their own, shouting for a medic before the gate was fully open. The med tent was 30 meters away. Nobody had any idea what or who was waiting inside it. The med tent doors burst open at 22:47 hours like the night itself had been torn apart. 3 men came through first, 2 operators half carrying Corporal Davies between them, his legs soaked through every layer of field dressing they had managed to apply in the dark. Behind them, Specialist Ortega was being dragged on an improvised litter made from 2 rifles and a jacket, his breathing shallow and irregular, his lips already carrying the faint blue tinge that nobody wanted to see. Sergeant Polk walked in under his own power, left arm hanging at an angle that suggested the shoulder behind it had opinions about the direction it was supposed to face. Sergeant Briggs came in last, radio in one hand, weapon still in the other, eyes scanning the tent with the urgent desperation of a man who needed someone qualified to appear immediately. What he found was a problem. Corporal Haynes, the duty medic, the man whose name was on the schedule, the man who was supposed to be standing exactly where he was needed most, was slumped against the far supply cabinet with a field dressing pressed to his own temple. A mortar fragment had clipped the tent's eastern edge 20 minutes earlier, a near miss that hadn't felt like a near miss to Haynes. He was breathing. He was not conscious. He was not going to be conscious for a while. Briggs stood in the center of the tent, 3 critically wounded men around him, and felt the specific terror of a soldier who has run out of options. "Somebody get on the radio. We need a medic flown in. We need." "Move." The word was quiet, not loud, not panicked. It carried no particular volume, and yet it cut straight through the noise the way a scalpel cuts, precise, clean, and impossible to ignore. Briggs turned. Ilara Voss was already crossing the tent. She had her gloves on before she reached the first casualty. She didn't run. Running in a medical space with injured men on the floor was how you created new problems. But she moved with a focused speed that covered distance faster than it looked. She dropped to her knees beside Davies, pressed 2 fingers to his neck, checked his airway, pulled back the soaked field dressing, and looked at the wound with eyes that went very still and very calm at exactly the same moment. "What is she?" one of the operators started. "Quiet," Ilara said, not unkindly, just clearly. She called out blood types from memory. She had quietly noted them from intake records during her first week, filed them away in the organized cabinet of her mind the way she filed everything, because information about the people around her was never wasted. She called for a second pressure pack, called for an IV line, and looked up once at the 2 soldiers standing frozen near the entrance. "You," she said, pointing at the taller one. "Bag on the left shelf, second row. Bring it here now. You." The second soldier, "I need the surgical kit in the gray case under the center table. Don't drop it." They moved. People tended to move when Ilara spoke in that voice. The voice she kept put away most of the time. The one that came out only when lives were sitting on a very thin edge. Briggs stepped toward her. "Listen, I don't know who you are, but you need to step back and let someone qualified." She looked up at him just once, just for a single second. Something in that look reached into Briggs' chest and rearranged whatever argument he had been building. He stopped talking. He stepped back. He wasn't entirely sure why, and later he would think about that moment with something close to embarrassment. A decorated combat sergeant, stopped cold by a look from a woman half his size in blood-stained gloves. But the look had not been aggressive. It had not been angry. It had simply been certain in a way that very few people ever are, the certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are doing and has no patience left for anyone who doesn't. She was already back on Davies, both hands working, applying direct pressure to the femoral bleed with a technique that made the wound stop its catastrophic flow within seconds. She talked quietly as she worked, not to the room, not to Briggs, but to Davies himself, low and steady, keeping him anchored to consciousness with the sound of a calm voice in a room that desperately needed one. "Stay with me, Davies, I've got you. Keep your eyes open, look at the ceiling, pick a spot, look at that spot. Good, good." Davies looked at the ceiling. His breathing evened out slightly. His hand, which had been clenched into a white-knuckled fist against his thigh, relaxed by a degree. Across the tent, Ortega's breathing hitched and changed. Ilara heard it. She was already moving. She assessed Ortega in 12 seconds, collapsed lung, left side, tension pneumothorax building, the kind of thing that killed people in the minutes between recognition and treatment. She called for the needle decompression kit without looking up, held out her hand, and one of the soldiers, the tall one, the one she had sent for the bag, placed it in her palm without hesitation. She had earned that trust in approximately 4 minutes. The procedure took 60 seconds. When it was done, Ortega's breathing opened up like a door coming unstuck, and the terrible blue tinge around his lips began, slowly, stubbornly, but definitively, to recede. Briggs stood against the tent wall and watched all of this happen, and felt the entire architecture of his assumptions about the quiet girl with the clipboard quietly collapse into dust around his boots. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. The tent was alive now, organized, purposeful, humming with the kind of focused energy that only exists when someone who knows exactly what they are doing takes hold of a situation and refuses to let it go. That someone was Specialist Ilara Vaz. And the night was nowhere near over. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when people realize they have fundamentally misunderstood something important. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is the silence of recalibration, the sound of assumptions cracking quietly at their foundations, of men who pride themselves on reading situations correctly suddenly understanding that they have been reading this one completely wrong from the very beginning. That silence fell over the med tent somewhere around the 40-minute mark. It fell when Sergeant Briggs watched Ilara suture a femoral bleed with the kind of technique that surgical residents spent years trying to master. Her hands moved without hesitation, without the micro-pauses of someone recalling a procedure from memory or working through uncertainty in real time. They moved with the deep, unthinking fluency of 10,000 repetitions, the hands of someone for whom this was not an emergency response, but simply a language spoken so long it had become native. Briggs had seen combat medics work before, good ones, decorated ones. He had watched them operate under fire and under pressure and had respected what he saw, but this was different in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. This was not the trained competence of a field medic. This was something else entirely, something quieter and deeper and considerably more dangerous to underestimate. "Where did you train?" he asked. His voice came out softer than he intended. Ilara didn't answer. She was already assessing Ortega's pressure levels, 2 fingers on his wrist, eyes on the second hand of the watch she wore on the inside of her left wrist. Old habit, surgical habit, the kind of detail that meant nothing to someone who didn't know what they were looking at and meant everything to someone who did. The tall soldier, Private Garrett, who had been handing Ilara instruments for the past half hour with the reverent focus of someone who had found unexpected purpose, looked at Briggs and shrugged. He didn't know either. Nobody knew. That was, in a very particular way, the entire point. What Ilara Vaz carried in her hands was the product of a life that had moved in directions most people never anticipated and nobody at Fob Kestrel had thought to ask about. Before the uniform, before the enlistment papers, before the deliberately unremarkable posting request that had landed her in this tent on this base, in this particular corner of a war that never fully ended, there had been 3 years inside a Level 1 trauma center in Baltimore, Maryland. She had walked into that hospital at 19 years old with a biology degree, a letter of introduction from a professor who believed in her with an almost aggressive certainty, and an appetite for the work that surprised even the trauma surgeon who eventually took her under his instruction. Dr. Raymond Acaffer, 28 years in emergency trauma, hands that had pulled people back from the absolute edge of death more times than he had counted, had watched her work for 2 weeks before calling her into his office and telling her, with characteristic bluntness, that she had a gift that he had seen in exactly 4 people in his entire career, and that she had an obligation not to waste it. She had not wasted it. 3 years under Acaffer's instruction had given her a foundation that most medical school graduates spent a decade trying to build. She had assisted in over 400 procedures. She had learned to read a body the way experienced pilots read weather, not from instruments alone, but from instinct refined by exposure, by pattern recognition so deep it lived below conscious thought. She had learned that trauma was, at its core, a problem-solving exercise conducted under time pressure, and that the most important quality a trauma physician could possess was not technical skill, but the ability to remain completely calm while everything around them was falling apart. She had always been calm, even before she learned why it mattered. After Acaffer, she had gone to Fort Bragg, quietly, through channels that required specific connections and a willingness to be evaluated by people who did not give compliments and did not lower their standards for anyone. The combat medical specialist program she completed there was attended by 38 candidates that year. 6 finished. She finished second, behind a former paramedic with 12 years of civilian emergency experience, and the lead instructor, a man named Sergeant Major Doyle who had served in every major theater of the previous 2 decades, had pulled her aside at graduation and told her she had missed first place only because she had stopped to help another candidate during the final field evaluation. She had not apologized for that. She didn't think it was something that required an apology. She had requested a non-combat posting afterward, not because the combat postings frightened her. She had processed fear into something manageable long ago, but because she had grown deeply, specifically tired of spending the first portion of every professional interaction dismantling the assumptions that men made about her before she had opened her mouth. A quiet posting, an overlooked role, a place where nobody expected anything remarkable from her. That was a place where she could simply do the work without the exhausting performance of proving she was allowed to do it. Fob Kestrel had seemed, on paper, exactly that. None of this was visible on her face as she moved through the tent. None of it announced itself. It simply lived in her hands, in the way she held an instrument, in the angle at which she approached a wound, in the particular economy of her movements that eliminated wasted motion the way a master carpenter eliminates wasted cuts. Briggs watched her perform a needle thoracostomy on Ortega, a procedure that required identifying the correct intercostal space by feel alone, inserting a large bore needle with precise controlled force, and managing the immediate physiological response with simultaneous attention to the patient's airway, and felt something shift permanently in his understanding of the world. He had been in combat for 11 years. He had seen extraordinary things done by extraordinary people under extraordinary pressure. He thought he had developed a reliable instinct for recognizing capability when it was in front of him. He had walked past this woman every day for 3 weeks and seen nothing. The thought sat in his chest like a stone. Alara looked up briefly, caught his expression, and read it with the same accuracy she read everything. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, not unkindly, not with triumph, simply with the steady acknowledgement of someone who has been seen, finally, and finds the experience neither surprising nor particularly satisfying. Then she looked back down. There was still too much work to do. There is a particular hour in every long night where the darkness stops feeling like a time of day and starts feeling like a condition, something permanent, something that has always existed and intends to keep existing regardless of what human beings want or need or pray for. In the med tent at Fob Kestrel, that hour arrived somewhere around 200. The initial rush of casualties had been stabilized. Davies was sedated, his femoral bleed controlled, his vitals climbing back toward numbers that allowed breathing room. Ortega was breathing, genuinely, evenly, the tension pneumothorax resolved, his color returning in slow degrees like dawn arriving in winter. Paulk had been sutured, splinted, and told twice to stop trying to sit up, advice he had ignored both times before Alara placed one hand firmly on his chest and said, with a quietness that brooked absolutely no negotiation, "If you move again, I will sedate you and you will miss the rest of the evening." Paulk had stayed down. Alara had been on her feet for over 4 hours. She had not eaten since 1700. She had drunk half a cup of water somewhere around midnight and immediately forgotten about it. Her lower back carried the deep, specific ache of someone who had been working bent over at angles that the human spine does not particularly enjoy, and her hands, steady throughout every procedure, unwavering through every critical moment, had begun to carry a faint tremor during the brief seconds when she wasn't using them. She noticed the tremor, she noted it, filed it, and kept moving. Private Garrett had become her shadow, anticipating instrument requests, managing IV lines, keeping the workspace clear with a quiet efficiency that had developed organically over the course of the night. He had started the evening knowing almost nothing about emergency medicine. He was ending it with a practical education that no classroom could have provided. He moved around the tent with the careful focus of someone who understood that the margin for error in this room was paper thin, and that his job was to make sure Alara never had to reach for something that wasn't already there. Briggs had stopped getting in the way. He had started being useful instead, managing radio communications, coordinating with the perimeter guard, keeping a running update on the medevac timeline. The helicopters were 90 minutes out at best, possibly longer. The weather east of the fob had deteriorated. He relayed this information to Alara without commentary, and she received it the same way, without commentary, without visible reaction. She simply adjusted her internal timeline and kept working. Then at 2:17 hours, the tent doors opened again. 2 more casualties from a secondary engagement at the northern perimeter, a skirmish that had erupted when a flanking insurgent element, apparently unaware that the primary ambush had failed, had probed the fob's outer wire and encountered the guards waiting for exactly that. The engagement had lasted 6 minutes. It had produced one operator with a compound fracture of the right forearm, bone visible, the kind of injury that was painful and serious but survivable, and one support soldier with blast injuries to the abdomen from an IED fragment that had clipped the perimeter wall and redirected. The abdominal injury was the problem. Alara assessed it in under 20 seconds and felt the night shift into a higher gear. Internal bleeding was a possibility she could not rule out without imaging she didn't have. She had to work from what she could see, what she could feel, and what her training told her about the physics of the injury and the likely trajectory of the fragment. She packed the external wound, established a second IV line, elevated the soldier's legs, and began monitoring his pressure every 3 minutes, watching for the specific pattern of decline that would tell her things were moving in the wrong direction faster than she could manage. She managed it, minute by minute, reading the body in front of her like a text she had studied her entire life, making micro-adjustments that nobody in the room was qualified to fully understand, but that everyone in the room could feel were the difference between the situation being managed and the situation managing them. At 2:41 hours, Master Chief Damon Reyes was carried through the tent doors. The room changed when he came in. Not dramatically, there was no gasp, no moment of theatrical recognition. It changed the way barometric pressure changes before a storm, in a way the body registers before the mind catches up. Reyes was Delta's anchor. He was the man the other operators oriented around, the fixed point in their operational universe, the person whose presence made difficult things feel possible. And he came in gray-skinned and motionless, carried by two of his own men, with a traumatic chest wound that had been field-dressed by someone who had done their best and known it wasn't enough. He had no pulse. The room went very quiet. A younger soldier, one of the privates who had been helping manage the tent through the night, took a single step backward and said it in a voice barely above a whisper. "He's gone." Not cruelly, just honestly, the way people say true things they wish weren't true. Ilara was already crossing the tent. She dropped to her knees beside Reyes, 2 fingers to his neck, eyes closed for 3 seconds of absolute concentration. Nothing. She checked his airway, partially compromised. She cleared it in 4 seconds. She assessed the chest wound, penetrating trauma, left side, the field dressing doing its job but the underlying damage requiring more than a dressing could give. She looked up at Garrett, "Defibrillator now." "Ma'am, he doesn't have a—" "I know what he doesn't have," she said, with a precision that was not unkind but was completely final. "Defibrillator now." Garrett moved. What followed existed outside of normal time, in that compressed, elastic space where critical moments stretch and the seconds feel both instantaneous and endless. Ilara worked with a ferocity that was almost difficult to watch, not because it was chaotic but because it was so completely controlled, so utterly focused, that it created its own kind of intensity. CPR with the correct depth and rate, perfectly maintained. Airway management simultaneous. Constant assessment, constant adjustment, constant refusal to accept the conclusion that the body in front of her was trying to present. 3 minutes, nothing. 4 minutes. The younger soldier who had said he's gone looked at the floor. Briggs, standing at the tent entrance, closed his eyes. And then, at 4 minutes and 22 seconds, at a moment when everyone in that tent, except one person, had quietly given up, Reyes made a sound. It was not dramatic. It was a single, rough, rattling gasp, the sound of a body remembering against all reasonable expectation that it still had things to do. His chest rose, fell, rose again. His color, gray and absent a moment before, began its slow, stubborn return. Nobody cheered. The tent remained silent, but it was a completely different silence now. It was the silence of people who have just witnessed something they don't have adequate language for. Ilara sat back on her heels for exactly 2 seconds. She looked at Reyes, at the rise and fall of his chest, at the returning color, at the vital signs that Garrett was already calling out in a voice that cracked slightly on the numbers. Then she stood up. She pulled off one glove, replaced it, and moved to the next patient. Because the night was not over, because there was still work to do, because Ilara Voss did not celebrate in the middle of things. She celebrated when everyone was stable, when the crisis had passed, when she could afford the luxury of feeling what the moment deserved. Right now she could not afford it. So she moved. She always moved. Dawn in eastern Afghanistan arrives without apology. It does not ease itself gently over the horizon, the way dawn does in softer places. It comes hard and fast, burning the edges of the mountains first, then flooding the valleys with a flat, uncompromising light that leaves nowhere to hide and nothing unrevealed. Soldiers at Fob Kestrel had learned to read that light practically. It meant the night's dangers were retreating. It meant visibility was returning. It meant the specific vulnerabilities of darkness were closing like a wound. On the morning of what would become one of the most quietly remarkable days in the FOB's operational history, That light arrived at 6:09 hours and fell without ceremony through the med tent's eastern panel, casting long, pale rectangles across the floor where 7 men lay alive who, by every reasonable military medical assessment, should not all have been. Alara was standing at the far end of the tent when the light changed. She had been on her feet for 8 hours and 41 minutes. She had performed procedures that required the hands of a surgeon, the instincts of a combat medic, and the endurance of someone who had simply decided, somewhere around the 3rd hour, that exhaustion was a problem she would address later. Her scrubs told the story of the night in layers, dried blood in patterns that a forensic examiner could have used to reconstruct every critical moment, every desperate intervention, every time she had dropped to her knees beside someone who was leaving and pulled them firmly back. She was checking Ray's vitals one final time when she heard the helicopters. The sound came from the south, the specific rhythmic percussion of medevac rotors that every soldier learned to distinguish from combat helicopter sound within their first month in theater. It was the sound of relief arriving, of the cavalry coming over the hill, of the moment when the weight of a crisis could finally begin to shift onto shoulders with more resources and more rest. Alara noted the sound, noted Ray's stable pressure, and began organizing her patient documentation. Clear, precise notes on every procedure performed, every medication administered, every timeline of intervention. She wrote in the small, exact handwriting of someone who understood that the next medical professionals to touch these patients needed accurate information more than they needed anything else. She was still writing when the tent doors opened. The lead flight medic's name was Staff Sergeant Aaron Cole, 10 years of medevac experience, over 200 combat extractions, a professional baseline of competence so high that very little genuinely surprised him anymore. He came through the tent doors at a controlled jog, trauma bag over one shoulder, eyes already scanning and assessing, ready for the chaos that forward medical situations almost invariably produced. He stopped moving within 4 steps. The tent was not chaotic. The tent was, and he would use this specific word later in his official report, and again in the conversation he had with his wife 3 weeks after returning home, and again years later when he told the story to a class of medevac trainees who needed to understand what genuine competence looked like, organized. 7 patients, all with established IV lines running clean. Wounds dressed with a precision that went beyond field medicine into something closer to surgical standard. Airways secured, positioning correct for each injury type, a written log beside each patient detailing interventions, timelines, medication doses, and current vitals, updated in handwriting so clear it looked almost printed. Cole stood in the center of all of this and turned slowly, taking it in. Behind him, his team was already moving, checking patients, reading the logs, cross-referencing what they found with what the logs described. Their movements, which had begun at the urgent pace of people expecting to manage a catastrophe, slowed and then quieted as they processed the reality in front of them. One of Cole's medics, a young corporal on only her 4th extraction, looked up from Ortega's chart with an expression that Cole recognized as the face people make when the math doesn't add up and they keep checking it anyway. "These interventions," she said carefully. "The thoracostomy on this one, the femoral repair on the first casualty, who performed these?" Cole turned to Briggs, who had been standing near the entrance since the helicopters landed, watching the flight medics process the scene with the expression of a man who had spent the last several hours having his entire professional worldview quietly restructured. "Who's your trauma surgeon?" Cole asked. "Who did they fly in?" Briggs looked at him for a moment, then he looked across the tent. Alara was at the far end, back to the room, still completing her documentation. Her shoulders carried the particular set of someone who has been holding tension for a very long time and has not yet given themselves permission to release it. She had not acknowledged the arrival of the medevac team. She was finishing her notes because the notes were important, and they were not finished yet. "That's Specialist Voss," Briggs said. Cole waited for the rest of the sentence. The rest of the sentence did not come. "I'm sorry, which Specialist Voss?" "That one," Briggs said. "Right there in the bloodstained scrubs." Cole looked at Alara. He looked back at Briggs. He looked at the 7 living, stable men around him. He looked at the surgical quality wound repair on Davy's leg. He looked at the log beside Ray's cot, the log that described, in clear sequential detail, 4 minutes and 22 seconds of CPR that had returned a pulse to a man who had arrived without one. "She's not a surgeon," Cole said. It came out less like a question and more like a man checking whether the floor was still where he thought it was. "She works the supply desk," Briggs said. The words landed in the tent like something physical. Cole's corporal looked up again from the chart she had been holding. 2 of the operators who were conscious, Polk, propped against his cot with his shoulder splinted, and his expression carrying the particular intensity of a man recalibrating several important beliefs simultaneously, and Davies, sedated but drifting toward the surface of consciousness, seemed to register the exchange. Cole walked the length of the tent slowly, reviewing every patient one more time, letting the evidence speak at full volume. Everything he saw confirmed what the logs described. Everything he saw represented a standard of care that he would have expected from a physician in a fully equipped trauma bay, not a single specialist in a forward tent with limited supplies and no backup. He stopped beside Ray's last, looked at the steady rise and fall of the chest, looked at the color that had returned to skin that had, by all accounts, been the color of ash when this man arrived. He exhaled, slowly, quietly, in the way that people exhale when they have been holding something without realizing it. Then he turned and found Briggs again. "I need her name on the official extraction report," he said. "Full name, rank, service number." "She's not going to like that," Briggs said. He almost smiled when he said it, the first thing approaching a smile that had existed on his face since before the mission went wrong. "I don't imagine she will," Cole said. He looked across the tent one more time at the quiet figure still writing at the far end, finishing her documentation, unbothered by the arrival of a medevac team that was currently dismantling every assumption it had walked in with. "I'm putting it in anyway." Outside, the Afghan sun climbed higher. The night was over. The reckoning, it turned out, was just beginning. Word travels differently inside a military structure than it does anywhere else. In the civilian world, information spreads horizontally, outward from its source in all directions simultaneously, losing precision and gaining distortion as it moves, arriving at its destination changed by every pair of hands that touched it along the way. Inside a military command chain, information moves vertically, up through layers of rank and responsibility, each layer compressing and verifying before passing it higher, until it reaches the level where someone has both the authority and the obligation to act on it. The information about Fob Kestrel's med tent moved faster than anyone expected. Cole's extraction report went up at 700 hours, filed with the clinical precision of a man who understood that what he had witnessed required documentation that could not be misread or minimized. He listed every patient. He listed every intervention. He listed the standard of care observed. And in the field marked performing medical officer, he wrote a name that stopped 3 different people in 3 different offices from whatever they were doing and caused each of them, independently, to pick up a phone. By 800 hours, the report had reached a desk that very few reports reached directly. Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne was not a man who invited description. The officers who served under him tended to communicate his qualities through what he did rather than what he was. He had served in the Gulf, in Kosovo, in Iraq twice, and Afghanistan 3 times. He had commanded SEAL operations that existed in classified files under names that meant nothing to anyone without the specific clearance to read them. He was 61 years old, lean in the way that men are lean when physical conditioning has been a non-negotiable constant for 4 decades. And he had a face that had been weathered by so many difficult environments that it had settled into an expression of permanent, considered assessment. He read Cole's report once, then he read it again. Then he called his aide and said 4 words, "Get me a helicopter." His aide, a sharp young lieutenant named Ferris who had learned in his first week that Admiral Thorne did not explain himself and did not repeat himself, asked no questions. He arranged the helicopter. He noted the destination. He did not ask why a rear admiral was personally flying to a forward operating base on what was not, by any official scheduling, a planned visit. Thorne landed at Fob Kestrel at 8:47 hours. The base received him the way bases receive unexpected senior officers, with a sharp, instinctive scramble of personnel reaching for their best posture and their most confident expressions, a sudden improvement in the visibility of productive activity, and a pervasive collective anxiety that expressed itself as heightened formality. Word of his arrival moved through the fob in approximately 90 seconds. Thorne ignored all of it. He walked directly to the medical tent, acknowledged the salutes of the soldiers he passed with the brief nod of a man who respected the gesture but had no time for its performance, and entered without announcement. What he found inside held him still for a moment. Not long, not dramatically, but with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a man who has spent a lifetime moving through difficult situations and has learned to give important things the single moment of full attention they deserve before acting on them. 7 men, 7 cots, 7 sets of vitals that had no business being as stable as they were given what he had read in Cole's report about their condition on arrival. The medevac team was completing its preparation for transport, moving with the efficient care of professionals who had absorbed the standard of what had been done here and were committed to maintaining it. Thorne walked the length of the tent slowly. He stopped at Davies, read the chart, looked at the wound repair, said nothing. He stopped at Ortega, assessed the notes from the thoracostomy, the timeline of intervention, the current breathing rate. He stopped at Ray's last, and here he paused longest, standing beside the cot of his most decorated operator with an expression that the young corporal who observed it would later describe as the closest thing to reverence she had ever seen on the face of a senior military officer. Ray's was conscious, barely, drifting in the shallow water between sedation and wakefulness, but conscious enough that when Thorne leaned slightly closer and said his name, his eyes opened. Thorne asked him one question, quietly, in a voice calibrated for the space between 2 people and no further. Ray's answered in 4 words, and then closed his eyes again. Thorne straightened. He turned to Briggs, who had remained in the tent through the medevac preparation, and now stood near the entrance with the expression of a man who had been awake for too long, and had processed too many extraordinary things for his face to fully organize its response to any of them. "Where is she?" Thorne said. Briggs didn't ask who. "Outside, sir, east side of the tent." Thorne walked out. Alara was sitting on an ammunition crate, the flat-topped olive green kind that served as improvised seating across every fob in the theater. She had her elbows on her knees and a tin cup of cold coffee in both hands, and she was looking at nothing in particular, or perhaps at everything at once, in the way that people look at the middle distance when their body has finally stopped moving, and their mind hasn't quite caught up to the fact that the emergency is over. She was still wearing the blood-stained scrubs. She had not removed her gloves, she was still wearing them, dried and darkened now, the evidence of the night preserved in detail on the nitrile surface. It was not an oversight. It was simply that she had not yet gotten to it. There had always been something more immediate to get to. She did not stand when Thorne approached. She looked up, registered his rank, registered his face, registered the weight of what his presence at this particular location at this particular hour represented, and then she looked back at her coffee. Thorne sat down across from her on a second ammunition crate without ceremony, without preamble, without the performance of authority that his rank entitled him to, and that most officers of his level deployed as a matter of habit. He sat the way a man sits when he has decided that the person across from him has earned a conversation rather than a briefing. They spoke for 11 minutes. The two soldiers nearest the tent entrance, Garrett and a perimeter guard, who had drifted close out of the specific human gravitational pull that important moments generate, could see them but could not hear a single word. They watched Thorne lean forward at one point, hands clasped between his knees, speaking with an intensity that his face rarely showed. They watched Alara respond, not quickly, not with the reflexive deference that junior ranks typically perform in the presence of senior officers, but thoughtfully, looking at Thorne directly, choosing her words with the same careful economy she applied to everything. They watched Thorne listen, really listen, the full, still, complete attention of a man who did not give it easily and was giving it completely now. At the 11-minute mark, Thorne reached into the breast pocket of his uniform. The challenge coin had been with him for 19 years. It had been given to him by his own commanding officer at the end of an operation in a country he was still not permitted to name, on a day that had tested every limit he thought he had, and revealed that his limits were further out than he had believed. He had carried it through every deployment since. He had been offered significant sums for it by collectors who understood its provenance. He had never given it to anyone, not once. Not in 19 years of observing extraordinary people do extraordinary things. He placed it in Alara's palm. She looked at it, at the worn edges, at the insignia that carried the weight of 2 decades of service, at the physical object that represented something language was not quite adequate to express. She turned it once in her fingers. Then she looked at Thorne. He held her gaze with the calm, clear directness of a man who meant exactly what he was saying without words. Then he stood, straightened his uniform, and walked back inside the tent to make a call that would set in motion a sequence of events that none of the people at Fob Kestrel, least of all the quiet woman still sitting on the ammunition crate, turning a coin slowly in her blood-stained gloves, were fully prepared for. There are moments in a military career that exist outside the normal flow of service, moments that do not belong to the daily rhythm of duty rosters and mission briefings, and the slow accumulation of experience that builds a soldier over years. They are rare, and they are unmistakable, and every person who witnesses one carries it for the rest of their life with the particular clarity that belongs only to things that matter completely. Fob Kestrel was about to have one of those moments. The formation order came down at 9:12 hours terse, immediate, carrying the specific authority of a directive that did not invite questions or accommodate scheduling conflicts. Every available body at Fob Kestrel was to assemble on the main parade ground at 1,000 hours in full dress. No exceptions. No explanations offered. The signature at the bottom of the order was Thorne's, and that signature alone was sufficient to produce the desired result in under 40 minutes. By 9:50 hours, the parade ground was full. Operators still in their post-mission gear stood beside administrative staff who had never fired a weapon in theater. Support personnel stood beside intelligence officers. Cooks, drivers, communications specialists, perimeter guards, every stratum of the FOB's population assembled in the flat morning light, with the collective posture of people who understood that something significant was about to happen and had not yet been told what. Briggs stood in the third row and looked straight ahead and thought about the night that had just passed with the slightly dazed quality of a man who has lived through something his mind is still in the process of filing correctly. Private Garrett stood 2 rows behind him and turned Thorne's challenge coin over in his mind. He had not seen it placed in Alara's hand, but Briggs had told him, and he had spent the intervening hour understanding what it meant and arriving at a conclusion about the person he had spent the night handing instruments to that felt both completely surprising and, in retrospect, entirely inevitable. Corporal Haynes, the duty medic, head bandaged, eyes carrying the specific guilt of a man who had been unconscious during the most important medical event of his posting, stood at the far left of the formation and stared at the ground with an expression that mixed professional humility with something approaching genuine awe. Alara stood in her assigned position in the formation, regulation placement, regulation posture, expression carrying nothing that the situation had not earned and nothing that invited comment. She had changed out of the blood-stained scrubs. She was in uniform now, clean and pressed, her hair correctly arranged, her bearing exactly what regulation required and nothing more. She had been told by Ferris Thorne's aide that her presence at the formation was required. She had nodded and asked no questions. She was good at waiting. At 1,000 hours precisely, Rear Admiral Marcus Thorne walked onto the parade ground. The formation snapped to attention with a collective precision that was itself a form of communication, a physical declaration that the people assembled understood the weight of what was happening even before a single word had been spoken. Thorne acknowledged it with a single nod, moved to the position from which he would address the formation, and stood for a moment in complete silence. He was not organizing his thoughts. His thoughts were already organized. He was giving the silence the respect it deserved, the silence before words that matter, the pause that separates ordinary speech from the kind that changes things permanently. When he spoke without notes. His voice carried across the parade ground with the unhurried authority of a man who had never needed volume to command attention. It was the voice of someone whose words arrived with their full weight intact, undiluted by performance or decoration, and landed exactly where they were aimed. He began with the mission. He described, in precise and unflinching terms, what Delta Element had encountered in the valley 12 kilometers east of the FOB the previous night. The ambush, the casualties, the failed extraction, the fighting withdrawal through hostile terrain while carrying 3 critically wounded operators. He named each wounded operator. He described the nature of each injury with the clinical specificity of a man who had read Cole's report multiple times and understood exactly what each injury represented in terms of survival probability without immediate intervention. He let those numbers sit in the morning air for a moment. Then he described what had been waiting in the med tent when Delta Element arrived. He did not embellish. He did not reach for dramatic language or the elevated rhetoric of ceremonial address. He simply described precisely, sequentially, completely, what Specialist Alara Voss had done between 22:47 hours and 6:09 hours on the night in question: the triage, the femoral repair, the needle thoracostomy, the management of 4 simultaneous critical patients with no backup, no surgical equipment beyond what a forward medical tent carried, and no assistance beyond 2 untrained soldiers she had organized and directed in real time. The abdominal trauma case. The 4 minutes and 22 seconds of CPR that returned a pulse to Master Chief Damon Reyes at a moment when everyone else in the tent had privately, quietly concluded that he was gone. He named each intervention. He named each patient. He described the standard of care that Staff Sergeant Cole's medevac team had documented upon arrival: surgical quality, he said, and he let that phrase carry its full meaning without amplification, because it did not need any. The parade ground was absolutely silent. Not the disciplined silence of a formation holding attention, something deeper than that, something that had moved past regulation into the territory of genuine collective stillness, the silence of 200 people absorbing something that was rearranging their understanding in real time. Thorne paused. He looked at the formation, not over it, not past it, but at it, moving his gaze across the assembled faces with the deliberate attention of a man who wanted every person present to understand that what he was about to say was being said to them directly, personally, without intermediary. The 7 operators who were carried into that medical tent last night, he said, represent a combined total of 143 years of special operations experience. They carry between them intelligence, operational knowledge, and institutional memory that this military has invested decades and resources beyond calculation to develop. Last night, all 7 of them were dying. He let that land. This morning, all 7 of them are alive. Another pause, shorter this time not for effect, but because what came next required its own space and he was giving it that space. That is not a coincidence. That is not luck. That is the direct result of one person, in one tent, through one of the longest nights this FOB has seen, refusing to accept any outcome other than the one you see documented in the medevac report filed at 700 hours this morning. He turned slightly, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but with the natural movement of a man directing attention to where it belonged. Specialist Ilara Voss. Her name in his voice, across that parade ground in that morning light, carried a weight that names do not usually carry, the weight of everything that had preceded it, everything the formation now understood, everything that the night had produced, and that daylight was now being asked to properly acknowledge. Ilara did not move. She stood at attention with her eyes fixed at the correct regulation point, her expression carrying the composed, forward-facing stillness of a soldier receiving a formal address. If the sound of her name in that context affected her, if the accumulated weight of the night, of the recognition, of the public declaration of what she had done, and who she was, produced anything in the interior landscape that her exterior so carefully managed, none of it reached her face. Thorne announced the soldier's medal recommendation. He announced the meritorious field promotion review. He announced the classified commendation. He announced each formally, without flourish, in the manner of a man discharging an obligation that he considered both important and overdue. Then he said one final thing, not in the register of official declaration, but in the quieter register of simple truth, spoken by a man who had spent his career learning the difference between the two and choosing the latter when it mattered most. In 26 years of service, Thorne said, I have had the privilege of witnessing extraordinary acts by extraordinary people in the most difficult circumstances. This uniform asks its wearers to endure. What Specialist Voss did last night belongs in that company. It belongs, in my assessment, at the front of that company. He held the formation's attention for one final moment. Dismissed. The formation broke, not with the immediate dispersal of a routine dismissal, but with the slower, more considered movement of people who were not quite ready to return to the ordinary world that existed on the other side of what they had just witnessed. Conversations began in low voices. Heads turned. Eyes moved to find Ilara in the dispersing crowd. She was already walking. Not away from anything. Not toward anything in particular. Simply moving back in the direction of the med tent, because there were supplies to restock and documentation to complete, and the work that existed on the other side of every crisis was always waiting, patient and unglamorous, for the person who understood that the work was the point. Briggs fell into step beside her without invitation. He walked with her in silence for a few paces, the comfortable silence of two people who have been through something together and do not need to perform their way through the aftermath. You could have told us, he said finally, not accusatory, just honest. Ilara considered the morning light on the mountains ahead, the flat, hard beauty of a landscape that asked nothing of anyone and gave nothing back without effort. You could have asked, she said. Briggs thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, completely, with the genuine acknowledgement of a man accepting a truth that was fair and correct and probably always had been. They walked the rest of the way to the med tent in silence. She went inside. The supplies were waiting. She began restocking the shelves quietly, precisely, without announcement, the same way she had done every morning since she arrived, and the same way she would do every morning after, because the work did not pause for recognition, and she had never needed it to. Outside, Fob Kestrel returned to the sounds of its ordinary day. But something had shifted, permanently, irrevocably, in the way that things shift when a truth that has always existed is finally seen by the people who needed to see it. It lived now in the way soldiers moved aside when Alara walked through a space, in the way eyes followed her with something that had not been there before, not the absent, furniture-registering glance of people who see without looking, but the attentive, respectful recognition of people who understand, finally, exactly who is in the room with them. She noticed. She always noticed. She said nothing about it. She simply did what she had always done, showed up, did the work, and trusted that the work would speak clearly enough for anyone willing to listen. It always had. It always would. End of Part 8.